Sounds good. And thank you so much, Cindy. And thank you everyone for attending. Really excited for today's session and for all the things we might have to talk about today. Exciting period here that we have with the whole team. And this is the first major full day webinar session that we've ever given. So this is for us an immensely exciting opportunity. So really appreciate your involvement. Just kind of looking back, give a little bit of background. So we were at the user group, the WUG, this past year, and we're able to meet with a whole bunch of not only customers, of course, but the partner community. And I was really taken by how interactive and collaborative the entire experience was. And we started talking amongst ourselves and saying, well, is there some way that we can kind of pool our resources together and have some sort of communal event such that we can bring in users and allow for them to kind of pick and choose across a whole buffet of options and discussion points and such, and try to provide some value that way to the entire user community. So that's really the genesis of this event. We really hope that it functions in that manner and gives you some help as a P21 community to try to dig in a little bit at some of these really interesting topics. And for me, integrations has been an area that has been extremely exciting for me personally as my career has evolved. And as EstesGroup kind of similarly evolved from a consultancy and application consulting firm to more of a managed services provider that focused on the hosting of the application in the cloud, what we realized was that standing up the application was actually the easy part. The challenge had to do with all these integrated systems, and this is really true for P21. P21 is a real integration heavy ecosystem. It relies on a lot of third parties to come in and fill in gaps and expand functionalities and provide things that the base footprint doesn't. What that means for system administrators, cloud administrators, application admins and such is that you have a much more complicated ecosystem to try and manage and take care of, such that you can keep the whole train on the tracks, I guess. So my session here will be discussing some of the kind of business case and other considerations that come along with an integrated environment, such that one, you can pick the right solution to integrate it and implement it successfully, and three, maintain and migrate, because what we often realize is the initial purchase and install of a third-party app is kind of the easy part. It's maintaining it over time, ensuring that you can move it when the rest of the environment moves becomes a huge consideration, because environments aren't static. And we find customers move from on-premise environments to the cloud. They might move into a SaaS environment, or they might move into a private cloud. They might work with a third-party provider like the EstesGroup to help them out with some of that server administration and those kinds of duties, or they might look to do it on their own. Whatever case, there's a lot of moving pieces that need to come along for the ride. We have some metaphors that we'll talk through today about that very subject. So we talk about application deployment, and we often think when we're deploying an application into a server environment, right? In the end, applications live on computers. Us techie folks have this fancy term for computers called servers. I always got that mistaken for the person who brings me my lunch, but you think about a server and that deployment, that's one thing, but there's a lot more that comes along with it. Because when we talk about servers, my tech team tend to go straight for the technical aspects, right? What are the resources that you need? And when we say resources, normally we're talking about CPU, RAM, disk storage. Those are kind of your cores, of course, to a server environment. And you get stuck with licensing issues, right? You have a multi-server environment where you have a database server and an application server. Then you need operating system and database licenses. And those database database application license, your RDBMS might change depending on how much resources you need. So they come part and parcel, right? And then you're talking about all the other things that come to managing that environment in terms of your firewall. Do you have something that you're managing with that firewall to make sure that you don't just have porous ins and outs, and you're putting yourself at risk to outside threats and such? Do you have your Active Directory? Do you have your users assigned such in a manner that your users are very clearly defined and you can only see the users that you need? That's really important. Do you have enough network bandwidth? Do you have enough backup and DRAS? All those pieces there become concerns that you need to be thinking about. And we even talked about all the integrations, right? You have now all those basics, and now you have to take all these third-party solutions and introduce that into the ecosystem. Now, those could, of course, change those things, right? If you're installing solutions locally, you might be requiring more CPU, RAM, disk space, et cetera. All these different solutions that interact with your environment introduce security challenges, potentially performance challenges. You want to make sure that the addition of these things aren't coming along and slowing down your overall system. And this is true whether you're building an environment from scratch. We have customers that come to us and they are at the onset of a P21 environment. Say, okay, I'm implementing the system. I need to put it on a contemporary stack, and then I need to add these third parties. That's kind of a nice greenfield place to be living in, but not everybody has that luxury. We have customers who've been on the app for 20 plus years, and we have their entire litany of past integrations using sometimes older technologies and different paradigms that may or may not interact successfully in this new environment, or at the very least will require some tweaking. So that's kind of the conundrum that we find ourselves in when we're dealing with an application deployment. Let's talk about a little bit about the terms, because quite often I find technically, it's very easy to throw out a lot of terms without necessarily clarifying what you're talking about. First, I like to use the term platform. When we were at the WUG this year, we gave a presentation on platform migration considerations. The first thing we had to say, well, what do you exactly mean by platform? And the reason I use platform instead of like application migration or cloud migration, it's that idea that you're moving the application plus all of its underlying, its architecture, its integrations. And so when we talk about kind of those three components, right, I like to think of the architecture as the house you live in, right? The ERP application, well, it's the resident, all right, the person that lives in that house. And then your third-party applications, those are your nice neighborhoods. So the platform ends up being, the entire neighborhood is coming along for the ride. And that makes for, whether it's a first-time build or a migration, it makes it a very significant consideration to put all those pieces together. Now, when we talk about that architecture, then we need to talk about some of your options, because these options as a P21 administrator or P21 user are really important to define how a given integrated system. And we're going to talk about 8 different integrated systems today during this webinar. So you'll get a lot of different views of how different providers are automating and integrating with the P21 application to solve business problems. And the way that they talk to the system might vary, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in significant ways, depending on that basic architecture that you have. So how is your system deployed becomes a big consideration in terms of how systems can integrate and what options are available to you to integrate them. So let's talk about the big 3 real quickly here. So on-premise, that basically is your classic traditional deployment model where you have your server stacks, you have computers either locally stored or you own the computers. You might have them in a data center, what we call co-location. And the idea there is it's all customer managed. You're responsible for the deployment of that activity. The data center, you might outsource it or own it internally. I see fewer and fewer, mostly either very small customers, very large customers going forward with their own data center, just because they have the overhead, the risk, the cost of things like redundant power, redundant cooling, physical security. That all becomes kind of burdensome, especially in a remote environment where now the people who are managing those servers might actually find themselves doing that remotely. The value of having your server on premise becomes less and less salient. But that's basically your on premise, and the level of responsibility you have in an on premise environment, it's all on you as a customer. And now probably the other side of the paradigm would be software as a service. So this is really the vendor manage it. So you as a customer, you don't see any of that back end instantiation, the database server, application server, all of that activity, you're kind of blind to because you're just consuming that application as a service, as a client. So you don't have to worry about all of that. So there's some really great things for users who are trying to, like when you don't have a strong IT department, you're not tech savvy, you just need that application. You don't need all the worries of the back end. There's a lot of value there because you can kind of outsource that to your vendor. The other challenge with that might be if you do need certain levels of access and control to the application server side, its back end. And we'll talk about how that impacts things like integrations, because integrations quite often require another level of access beyond that of a simple client-side end user. And then between those two, you have kind of your two ends of the spectrum, on-premise on one side, and you have SaaS on the other. Here you have private cloud kind of sitting in between that. So in this case, you have a licensing model that is very similar to an on-premise and a level of access and control that is very similar to on-premise. The biggest difference is these servers are virtualized and pumped up into the cloud so that you don't have those physical hardware maintenance requirements. So the level of access and control is pretty much on-premise level. You can get in there and you can go at any level in terms of getting to the data, managing the middleware application server layers. The biggest difference is that some of the responsibility now resides in the cloud provider versus you yourself. So this is really an important conversation to have in terms of these apps, because this is really your base application, and how it's deployed takes us into the term, here's another fancy term, hybrid cloud. Okay, I'm sure you've heard that term, and I spent a lot of time in my career just trying to figure out what that means. Was this simply a marketing term, or is there some value in trying to understand just what that means? All right. So I like to use the word, the metaphor bound and chained, and I did this because the government department NIST did it, or as the Pixies said, we're chained. It sounded a lot better when Black Francis said it, so I'm not going to go any further there, but I would look up that song if you're a Pixies fan. Certainly am myself. Well, hybrid cloud, let's read the government version of it. If it's the government version, it has to be right? Cloud infrastructure is a composition of two or more distinctive cloud infrastructures that remain unique entities, but are bound together by a proprietary or standardized technology that enables data and application portability. Boy, that's a mouthful. I think the biggest piece there that I like to think of is separate cloud models. So you might have, we talked about the previous slide, we have on-premise, we have a hybrid cloud, we have SaaS. You might have a hybrid cloud deployed ERP that is speaking to a SaaS deployed e-commerce system. Okay, so you have two different cloud models, and they are speaking to each other because they have either a standardized or proprietary technology that allows for them to talk to each other. So when they say data and application portability, really all we're saying is, yeah, that means that you're allowed to pass data back and forth, and you're able to automate processes. And that's when you have that, you essentially have a hybrid cloud. So the funny thing is we talk quite often about distinct clouds, and then we realize that pretty much 99% of the community has some form of hybrid, because, as I had said earlier, the P21 application is very integration intensive. So this hybrid cloud infrastructure, that idea of boundedness, we kind of have two common ways of binding different cloud infrastructures. I mean, we call those interfaces and integrations. Now, there's another one of those sets of terms that can be used very loosely, and they often get swapped out for another. I think there's an important distinction, and especially this becomes important in terms of best practices, maintainability, portability. The difference between these are really important to understand. So interface, we talk about that. That's what I would call a simple connection, right? It's kind of connection based. People think of it as sometimes quick and dirty. All right. It's something that an individual developer might code. You might, as a customer, code an interface yourself. They sometimes are temporary. Quite often they're one direction, they're unidirectional. They're a dump of data back and forth. But the two applications and the two cloud models that are connected are still very loosely bound. And that's, I think, the key about an interface, is that it's quite often proprietary. It's quite often not reusable. And it's, I would say, from our own experience at Estes with cloud migrations, it tends to be a little more brittle because it is so situationally specific. And when we do migrations, we run into a lot of cases where interfaces end up being hard-coded in some manner, that their IPs, computer names, URLs, things that allow them to be bound, those key credentials, we might call them, are themselves very hard-coded and not very flexible. So that when you move an environment, the first thing that breaks are all the interfaces. Now, an integration is more of a comprehensive series of connections between applications. So this is quite often provided by an integration provider. It's much more of a platform than it is a single connection. So I like to think of it as, how you put it, in central, the Midwest, the Mississippi River is this big dividing point, right? And there are only certain places where you can cross the Mississippi, very few bridges, all right? Think of each of those bridges as an interface. Now take the paradigm, flip it, and think about yourself just being on the prairies where you have a whole bunch of country roads, all right? And each of those country roads will allow you to traverse across the country, and you have many, many options because there are so many connection points. I came from the prairies, so country roads are near and dear to my heart. So I would think of an integration versus an interface. That an interface is a nice little bridge, whereas an integration platform, it's much more comprehensive and multifaceted. Quite often, these are built by large teams of developers. They're bidirectional. They allow two applications to often act as one. And you'll see that quite often when, say, a vendor will buy a third-party app that has been previously interfaced and then built a much more elaborate integration to that third party so that it no longer feels, at least to the end user, like it's a separate application. And we have several folks today who not only provide point solutions in, say, the areas of AP automation or e-commerce or what have you, but they also provide kind of underlying architectures for integrations, an integration platform, let's say. And I think that's a really big value prop inside of the P21 community going forward. So we've talked about some of the terms. We go about this idea of the hybrid cloud lurking under the surface. And I think for me, stories are often the most helpful way of talking through these kinds of things. And I had one story that a client had recounted to me, and it was a cloud migration that kind of had gone awry for them. And it all had to do with this hybrid cloud situation. So the customer is talking to the vendor and like, how long will it take to migrate to your cloud? And the vendor's, oh, migrate to the cloud 2 months tops. Okay. Customers like, well, but I have a lot of integrations. Is this going to be a problem? The vendor's like, it'll be fine. All right. So the customer went along with it. Now we have a big period of delay and extension, and the customers coming back to their vendor and like, dude, this ain't working. This isn't working as promised. We were talking 2 months. The application itself, we managed to move that easily in 2 months, but everything else, it took more than 6 months, and it's costing a ton of money. And the vendor didn't have much of an answer here because in the end, all of these integrations that moved to the cloud created all this work in reconfiguring, sometimes rebuilding the integrations or interfaces that connected that main application to its hybrid cloud. So I like to use the iceberg metaphor here because there's this idea of whatever you call your third-party hybrid cloud, your integrations, your interfaces, your bolt-ons, your third parties, your homegrowns, we call them a lot of things. That's really that iceberg that's lurking under the surface. So when you look at a migration, you're thinking about all what I would call the easy stuff. But the big key here from a planning standpoint, when you're building an architecture or when you're moving an architecture, you really got to be considering, what is all that stuff underneath it? Because there's huge value, of course, in integration platforms and third-party platforms. We wouldn't be having this session if it wasn't for the business value that these systems offer our customers. The key is that in kind of the understanding and the management of that, to make sure that we understand that what's lurking under the surface and raise it to the surface, essentially. And as cloud migration specialists, there's a fancy term I didn't plan on using, we run into this situation a lot where we'll have a customer and we'll be doing a discovery where we're kind of doing a forensics of their existing environment so we can move it into the cloud and talking through everything they do. And at some point, the customer kind of looks at us and has this kind of deadpan discovery. The light bulb goes off and they're like, I didn't realize I had so many integrations. I didn't realize I had such a complex ecosystem here. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? Turnover is often something that happens. end users may not even realize that there's something non-standard going on, that there is an interaction happening. They're just assuming that it's all just functionality. Quite often the documentation at the time of the construction may not be complete. It might get lost. It might be stuck in the heads of users who retire or take jobs elsewhere. You might have some custom bolt-ons with interfaces where the developers construct them and then they leave. So all that knowledge of how that thing was built goes away. And we run into a lot of people who are like new managers, IT directors, IT managers, CIOs, who inherited an ecosystem that they did not build. So they're struggling to figure that out. Another big key reason is vendor relationships atrophy over time. We'll talk about that. I'm a big believer in vendor relationships, both as a cloud provider and as an end user. I would recommend strong vendor relationships. We'll get there, but when those atrophy, you lose connection points to the technicians who helped you get there to begin with, and as upgrades and such happen, you may not keep that information. So really, you find yourself, you've heard it all, I'm sure all the term spaghetti code, right? Where a program has a lot of like go-tos and it's really kind of a big meandering mess of business logic. It's not very object-oriented such. So we've heard spaghetti code mentioned since time out of memory. And when you get to a case where you have kind of the equivalent at an ecosystem level, you have a spaghetti system. And that's for us, the challenge of our job is in helping customers kind of unwind that spaghetti system and get the noodles in a row. It's a bad pasta metaphor, but let's talk about another kind of metaphor that I like to use here in my mind, because it helps me kind of ground myself when I'm talking to a customer about, customers come to us and they're saying, well, what's a good CRM and BI app? Or what is a good document management app? And when we talk about, the different criteria for selecting, right? Software selection is more than just your base system. You need to have some criteria when you're looking at software selection for an integrated system. And quite often, maintainability and portability are things you need to think about, because there's base functionality. That's quite often the thing we think about is the base functionality. Does it function well enough? Assuming that underlying maintainability, portability will sort itself out. Quite often it doesn't, and quite often that absence of maintainability, portability means big bucks when it's time to upgrade, move, etc. So when I talk with a customer, I'm really trying to get them focused first on the idea of the hub and the spoke. So an ERP application and all of its integrated systems, I like to think about as a hub and spokes. Take that hub, that becomes your starting point for everything, really. Everything revolves around that hub. And the spokes, they're coming along for the ride, all right? Your migration options, if you're migrating a ecosystem, it all depends on where your hub goes. So where your hub goes, everything else has to follow, and your ease of migration depends on that hub. So how successful is that hub at connectivity in terms of connecting to all kinds of other systems? Now, I'll use an example here with one of our older customers who had a system where they had a bunch of very legacy AR integrations, I believe it was, that were all operating at the SQL Server level. And these had things like stored procs and SQL schedules, and sometimes a combination of the two that were triggered and instantiated and activated, and they pulled data in, they push data out inside the network and outside the network. All of those things were predicated on an on-premise model. So if they were, say, going to now try and move that to a pure kind of web cloud or SaaS-based model, those solutions may needed to be modified and somehow to be able to allow it to still function. Now, some vendors are kind of evolving that ability to have SQL Server level activity happening at that lower level, but you probably find yourself still needing to find new ways to trigger those, to activate those, et cetera, that were different than what you had been doing in your on-premise environment. So you change that hub out, man, all those spokes suddenly need to reorientate themselves to that new hub. And this another metaphor here was something that I had on the introductory slide. And I like to think of an application ecosystem as kind of like a confused octopus. All right, it's a body with many tentacles. and not all the tentacles necessarily get along, right? So you have the head is moving along at a certain rate. All right, the tentacles generally are kind of lagging behind. Some of them are moving at their own pace. Some of them start to drag away, right? The head kind of pulls away and some of the tentacles drag. What causes a tentacle to drag? Well, let's say the vendor goes out of business. All right, now what happens to that application? Do they sell you their source code when they go out of business so that you can maintain it themselves, or do they sell it to another vendor and that vendor just sunsets it abruptly? I've seen that happen before. So you run into situations where I want to move this head, I want to move my ERP into a new world. Well, the question you immediately see is, well, what's dragging on you? Because you can kind of feel that state of inertia from all these tentacles grabbing on your application, saying, no, I got to catch up if you're going to keep moving. So the key there is understanding each of those tentacles. If you have, something, if you're going to, move your solution into SaaS and your tentacles are all still steeped in stored procs and SQL schedules and stuff, you might find yourself in some deep water. So you really need to keep kind of a mind's eye on that super user, right? So you have kind of on-prem, private cloud, and SaaS. You have these different levels in this environment. So in an on-prem world, you have your end user communicating directly with the architecture, and your super users, they might actually be getting inside of the ecosystem, inside the server ecosystem, to maintain the middleware server, maintain the database server. This might mean re-indexing. This might mean clearing out temp files or truncating log files or what have you. You have something similar. The client, the users are still connecting. And in a private cloud, we kind of tout our private cloud access and control such that, power users, system administrators from our customers can get in there and do those kinds of things. Now, in a pure SaaS cloud, like you say, the environment is not visible to you either as an end user or as a super user. There's essentially, there's a pretty firm barrier that keeps you from getting in and doing those. So if you're a super user and you're responsible for those integrations, you might find yourself having to do that kind of administration in a very different manner. We talk about with our partners here that are in this event this week, many of them have different versions of their solution that have kind of a SaaS version and an on-prem / private cloud version, because they can take a whole batch of program files, EXEs, DLLs, et cetera, and deploy those inside of your network, whether it's a private cloud or an on-prem, and have those interact more directly with your application, versus a SaaS version, which is now working at the application programming interface or API layer. If you want to charge me by the acronym, there's another one. So the API layer, where these same solutions will have kind of the discussion level over the internet using a protocol like REST, commonly these days, how you can integrate. And so talking about a migration, so we have a certain set of migrations that we've seen in the past. And when we talk about kind of two things, there's kind of two decision points in the career of your ERP system, right? One is which one to buy initially. You might have this for your ERPs or your third-party solutions. You might then also have the question of deployment, and deployment is an evolving situation, right? As I've told you, we have customers who've been on P21 for 20 plus years. Average server life, let's assume a server lives for 5 years. So over a 20-year standpoint, you're asking that question, 4 times. Do I continue just replace my local on-premise servers with some more and just keep on keeping on? Or do I look at some new migration path? And even when you're in a migration path, you might find yourself that you want to make further changes. And I've seen that. I've seen customers go from on-premise to private cloud and then to SaaS. Sometimes I see them come from SaaS and go back to a on-premise, or from SaaS back to a a hybrid cloud or a private cloud. Those movements are really common right now in the ERP world. We run into those all the time. Folks coming to us asking questions of, what should we be doing? Which direction should we be going? What's the best for our specific situation? Because every customer has some very unique circumstances around which their life is built. And I would say that due to an abundance of factor, complexity of business processes, number of integrations, staffing, desire of control and access, reporting requirements, all those things drive whether or not you're in the right cloud environment or not. So if you see you're in a situation where you're moving from an on-premise, to a private cloud, I would expect largely an apples to apples change. You would find probably a lot of your little bolt-ons and interfaces might break because of hard code changing, differences in licensing, etc., IP changes, computer name changes. If you have things that are hard-coded around that, you'll find that those are changing. Now, if you have a more elegant approach with these solutions like config files and such, then you might find yourself going into the config file to make the changes, which is, normally a preferable option if at all possible. Now, if you're going from an on-premise to SaaS, really the key there is it puts the onus on your integrated solutions and how flexible they are in terms of handling API level communication, because API is really in SaaS environments, API level is kind of the de facto, your starting point. It's how do we keep these systems talking at that level, that abstracted API level, so we're not incurring risk, cross-pollination, communication that we don't want within the environment. So you might find yourself running into some potential changes, third-party limitations due to access levels. You might find yourself having to, either do like replication out to a private cloud to support reporting or BI. You might find yourself, modifying existing integrations or maybe throwing them out entirely and having to buy a new one that has that higher level. So that's one consideration to make when you're moving your ecosystem. Moving from private to private, and we see that surprisingly a lot. We'll run into it in our own businesses, folks who have their system deployed with a managed IT service provider, and they come to us and they're like, well, we want to have it in a private cloud with a managed IT service provider, but we'd like someone who has a little background in the ERP application so that they can help us there if something breaks in the ERP. So we see folks coming to us there, again, very similar to an on-premise to private cloud move. And then if you're moving, say, from a SaaS to a private cloud, really, I think I haven't seen those have a lot of challenge, because if it can work within a SaaS environment, it can work within a private cloud. So really there, you're just working on the individual connections rather than rebuilding any of them. And then from a private cloud to a SaaS, I'd say it's really similar then in that case from going from on-premise, because on-premise and private cloud functionally have similarities. You can anticipate the same kinds of challenges when cloud SaaS. Right, so now talking about software selection, API selection, it's really good to understand kind of the functionality of how this thing gets triggered, how this thing operates, at what level it's operating. And because those things help you understand if there are any liabilities to selecting a system that might break based on your strategic moves in terms of cloud. So we sometimes see customers are on the move in terms of their application platform, and they'll be asking a vendor, hey, is this portable to the cloud? And yes, of course. But as we've seen earlier, the term cloud is a really kind of nebulous subject matter. So you really need to nail down, the terminology. And some of this comes at working at a higher level of abstraction, talking about some of these things. So two things that I like to think about is, how does the thing communicate at what level? And then how is it triggered? So is it an API level conversation where really the ERP system has exposed REST APIs to do your classic posts and updates, and that allows for an application to plug into those and communicate? That can be really helpful, especially if you have an application that's already REST ready. I was working with this one CPQ system, configure price quote. This was for a more complex product. And it had a whole integration toolkit where really it was just waiting for those REST API credentials on what it needed to do. And it just basically plugged those in. It was a no code environment so that you could do everything you needed in the application. And when it came time to push that into the ERP system, it was kind of a one push button, very, very helpful, very robust kind of API layer. So APIs, a lot of benefits to them. Quite often, I would say the biggest challenge with API layer communication might be performance, and it might be if the vendor's API does not model its entire application layer. I've seen that in cases where a vendor's API layer does not approximate everything you can do at the lower levels. So if there's a certain kind of transaction you need to do that can't be hacked, can't occur at the lower level, you might find yourself in a problem. So if we talk about API, then we talk about, application layer. This is more talking about like the client level. I've seen, especially in like desktop applications, I've seen cases where stuff occurs on the desktop as opposed to the server, and it works through the desktop to communicate, kind of like a client level interface. Those tend to be problematic just because you have so many clients that if you're not working off of a terminal server, a centralized terminal server, if you have a bunch of end users, those integrations become very painful to maintain. And I've seen that happen where you have client DLLs in a company that has 100 users. Oh, boy, keeping that all in sync and up to date can be a real hassle. Now, server level, in the ERP system that I came from, the most common integration method before the APIs were introduced was the server level, because this allowed you to use application business logic to model actual transactions without having to go straight to the database. And that was great because the business object should perform the same creation of, say, a sales order or a sales order line, regardless of whether you're hitting it from the desktop app or hitting it from a custom program. So that was very helpful. And I'd say the lowest level, and quite often the most problematic from a maintenance, is database level integrations. And like I gave with my earlier example, in an application that used to be a two-tier, like Prophet 21, right? It was two-tier. You had your desktop application, you had your server. Your integrations needed either to be an application layer or a database layer integration. So what you end up with was a lot of SQL procs, stored procedures, as I mentioned, and then SQL schedules triggering these things. And that could create, challenges if you had to move that environment and do something differently with it. So that's kind of the application layers. You want to talk to your vendor and ask, how does this thing interact, and how does it make that communication? Now, another level of interaction you want to think about has more in terms of how it's triggered, right? Is this a scheduled process? Is it invoked through a user? Is there some sort of user trigger, or is there some sort of business logic infrastructure that's promoting that? You have something there where you're automating something as a function of a push from an outside system. I'd say e-commerce is probably the example I'm thinking of there, right? You have an e-commerce system that enters an order in there, and then it pushes that into the ERP now, so that you can fulfill that through your ERP system. Schedules probably are the biggest concern, because if something is on a schedule, that means you have some form of local install that it needs to be located somewhere. So your application deployment, now you're deploying, some services. Maybe you're deploying a program like an EXE or a DLL that gets triggered by a Windows schedule. You might have PowerShell tends to be something that I've seen used not infrequently these days. That you have PowerShell scripts that get scheduled. So understanding what all those moving pieces are when you're working with someone who's an integration provider, understanding what does it all entail to get this thing into my ecosystem and running appropriately. So we have a couple of examples here of, I call these like handshake agreements between a application and its third party. And I just walk through a couple of these that are worth noting. Crystal reports, of course, is a big deal in a lot of environments. I've seen some vendors kind of stop support of Crystal reports, and then you're figuring out now how to reference that new one. Quite often, Crystal reports have ODBC connections that are specific to a database, so those need to come along for the ride. So I've seen, several of those requiring kind of that new local installs. You have to deploy that to your local cloud server, change those. Sometimes the individual ports themselves have those credentials, and you have to change those individually. So if you have a reporting solution where each individual report has credentials and it doesn't inherit credentials, be real careful there, because you might find yourself with a lot of work ultimately to get that thing to work. Another one here, let's talk about a reporting solution that's internet connected, putting it into essentially a data warehouse so you can report against it, right? So from the application side, the key there was just configuring it to connect to the appropriate IP and database. So that meant you are opening the appropriate port and then whitelisting specific incoming IPs. That's really important there, that you're controlling that at the firewall level, so that stuff coming in and that you're not just giving that access carte blanche, right? You want to make sure that you're whitelisting only specific IPs to come in and get that data that's needed. Here's my other favorite handshake. Anybody remembers the 1980s? Dating myself here. I remember whole groups of young men doing bicep curls to try to be able to do that epic handshake. I don't think any of us ever made it, but talking about, here was one that was a good example, an AR automation solution. It received like an open invoice load on a batch schedule. It was all SQL based. What we had to end up doing was tweaking that stored procedure and schedule to adjust for the database in question, and then whitelist that outbound request so that it could get out successfully, right? You're always thinking about not just what's coming in, but what are you letting get out? Now, what I think here also is a real important one is this example here with a third-party quality management. It was a real simple install, except it was key to the vendor. So we worked in our case with the vendor to get them access to perform the install, configure the application, start up the Windows service, and then show our team how to keep that thing running. So then we were in maintenance and monitoring mode. So this was one of those cases where I think a real helpful is if your vendor's still out there, getting them engaged to help with that connection and that integration was hugely valuable. So went through a couple of examples, real key here. I think it's really important for companies to have a good understanding of what you all have in your system. So we have kind of a checklist when we meet with a new customer. And this is honestly something that we'll talk to a customer with if they're doing an implementation or a cloud migration, and just try to understand what is the scope of this thing? What is the shape of this thing? What are the moving parts and what are the risks? And knowing all of the potential areas that you'll need to work through. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, folks sometimes forget about what they all have. And then this might involve, going at a detailed level and working through, your application config, and if they're standalone config files, folder locations, scripts of various type, go and have a look at ISS and see what app pools are running, because quite often that's a place where things can hide. It's really a case, it's kind of investigation work, some detective work to figure out just what is in your environment. Now, I'd say if you were a new manager coming into an environment, that would probably be a real important first step yourself to understand just what is all out there, because your own team may not have current knowledge about what that environment looks like due to loss of tribal knowledge and attrition and such. So if we're talking about a hybrid cloud recommendations, what we've talked about here, that idea of discovery, get under the hood early. My biggest, when I'm talking to my tech team about the biggest technical recommendation, theirs was actually something much more soft skill, and it was, again, vendor involvement. Your vendors are your friends. Keep those relationships active during your lifetime with them, and make sure that you're kind of open to whatever communication you're getting from them in terms of updates, changes, assistance, so that when it comes time to make a change like a deployment or an upgrade, you have them around to help in case something doesn't go where you want. Now, if you have developers who've created some of these, get them involved early where possible, and get that stuff documented. Try to figure out where your source code, your installation files exist. And then for each connection that you find, figure out, do you have that source code? Does it connect? What level? Is it using hard code connections or config files, right? What triggers is it using? These are all critical things to understand the nature of that application itself. Sometimes the end users might have some good feedback there. Sometimes the developers would be the key. Quite often, having both of them engaged is helpful. certainly security. Now I'll have Brent and Caleb talk more about some of the technical security level questions, but there's certainly, as a security standpoint, huge importance to those kind of concerns. And make sure you're thinking about upgrades, both to that base system and to any tertiary system. Software doesn't stand still, so you got to keep your idea of how that software might be moving over time. So that said, thank you very much for your time today. Really excited for the whole day and everything that's in store for us. So thank you again, and really looking forward to, we'll have a little time here for questions before we go to break. So if you have any here, I'd love to hear them. And outside of that, looking forward to our next session.